is a good website, another one of those good websites to kind of put in your repertoire, like the Avalon Project. But this one's done by the government. This is the Social Security. And when we get into, this is the Social Security website, the history, and when we get into the discussion, the timeline of dual federalism and cooperative federalism and the power of the federal government's expansion, even the Social Security Administration, the government points out that the Social Security Act was not something that was easily passed. In fact, there were a number of different policies that came out of the Roosevelt administration that were found unconstitutional. So many so that many believe, and there's some discrepancy to this, but many believe that the court packing scheme, where Roosevelt was going to increase the number of justices who would be favorable to his ideas about the Constitution, that it was born out of that, and because of that threat, that one of the 9 judges who were opposed to the New Deal legislation, things like Social Security, switched their position, interpreted the Constitution a different way, and by a 5-4 decision, or whatever the case may be, the New Deal and the policies of the New Deal from Roosevelt's administration were approved, were supported, not found unconstitutional. And that's even discussed here, acknowledged here, if you will, by the Supreme Court rulings on the Social Security Act. The other reason I have it up here is it goes back to this when we talk about disputes among the founders, that from the beginning, both Federalists, whether you talk about Madison or Hamilton, that there's, according to the history of the Social Security Administration anyway, that there was a discrepancy in terms of what taxing and spending meant by the federal government. According to the Social Security Administration, and under Hamilton's ideas as a Federalist, he thought that this meant that the government could levy new taxes and undertake new spending if doing so improved the general welfare in a broad sense. Right? That's that provide for the general welfare component of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Madison, which was shared by Thomas Jefferson, remember, Madison and Jefferson come together as discussed. Jefferson's the president, Madison's the Secretary of State and later president. But Madison, even though Jefferson was no Federalist, Madison believed that as pointed out, that it was much more narrow when it came to. Madison thought the federal government could only expend money for purposes specifically enumerated in the Constitution, And that later becomes known as the strict construction doctrine, while Hamiltonian view is called the doctrine of implied powers. Okay? Now, this idea, we discussed implied powers. We talked about implied powers in the Cullet versus Maryland case. That the idea of implied powers were established by Marshall, who was also a Federalist, obviously more of a Hamiltonian Federalist, that the Constitution didn't have to specifically enumerate, again, in the Constitution, those powers of the federal government. It could imply or infer. And that's ultimately what you got in terms of the ability to establish the federal banking system, of which Hamilton supported. But with that idea of implied powers being established as precedent in the necessary and proper clause, later on down the road, when we actually do get to discuss policies that aren't even remotely, at least, implied by Article 1, Section 8, as long as it's providing for the general welfare, it should be constitutional. And as we discussed in class, how do you define general welfare? What is general welfare? What is tough love? Let me ask you guys that question. What is tough love? When a parent says, you know what?
I'm cutting you off.
What's that?
I'm cutting you off.
I'm cutting you off? Why? Why would you cut somebody off? To hurt them?
Make them do
No, because they're a little over.
Well, so in the long term, in the long run, the idea of tough love is actually to help, not to hurt, right? Am I not mistaken? So different individuals can take a different approach to the idea of general welfare and say, listen, if I'm going to give you something, I don't think I'm going to be teaching you that personal responsibility. So out of love, I'm not going to give it to you. And in the long term, that's in the best interest of the general welfare. I mean, there are a billion different ways to go with the concept of general welfare. And ultimately, what it comes down to is which way is the court going to go on it. Yeah.
And haven't we gone both ways during the New Deal?
Yeah.
Was really where
Yeah.
public assistance started and all that, and during the Clinton years, reversed.
Yeah. We've gone multiple ways on that. It wasn't just wasn't just during the New Deal, it was from the New Deal on. And there's not just the New Deal, then you also get the Great Society. You get other attempts of the federal government to provide those things maybe not intended by the Founding Fathers to be a function or a role of the federal government. And again, whether or not you agree or disagree, whether you're more of a ends justifies the means kind of individual, that the Constitution implies equality and security and protection, and therefore however you get there, that's fine. Or if you're more of a strict constructionist who says, listen, this is what it says. If you want to change what it says, you go through the formal process of changing it. You don't just simply ignore it because you want a different outcome. At the end of the day, the ends are what matters. It's how you get there, or decide to get there, that separates us ideologically.
Well, I was just going to add, given the present economic situation,
Right.
would it be more, helpful to open up opportunities for those who are less fortunate?
Great question. Great debate. We're having that debate right now. The stimulus money and whether or not we should be spending this money that we don't have to keep the economy going to catch it on the back end. This, I assume, having not been there, but I assume that these were the same debates going on in the late 1930s during the Great Depression. Doesn't it make sense to do this, to stimulate the economy now? Keynesian economics, which we'll touch on today, the deficit spending. Well, I showed you the debt clock. Deficit upon deficit equals debt.
Yeah.
And eventually, we don't have to pay that debt back all at one time, but every dollar you incur in debt, particularly those dollars that are held by foreign governments, foreign entities, you don't get any purchasing. You don't get anything for that. You don't get a better school for that money that's left the country. You don't get a better road for that. So the more money we end up in debt, and the principal that we have to pay, we pay interest on that. Principal we pay and interest. Those are monies that are lost to the economy. Those are opportunities that are lost. That is stimulus that is lost. So I'm not saying necessarily that deficit spending is bad. Deficit spending really isn't bad. Deficits don't have to be bad, but it's deficit upon deficit upon deficit. It's the debt that is incurred that becomes the problem. And right now, as I showed you guys that debt clock, for every taxpayer, right, and it's about to the population, about 1/3 of the population are actual taxpayers. To the taxpayer, people paying the taxes, if you wanted to pay that debt off this year, each one of those taxpayers would have to come up with an extra, because you still have to fund the government what it does, an extra $112,000 to pay off the debt that is owed. Per person, right? And this is where you get into a graduating, and again, this is taxpayers, but those individuals who are taxpayers down here, and those individuals who are taxpayers, they should pay more, and these individuals should pay less. But $112,000 on average to every individual, it's just too much. I mean, it's just too much. And to pay the regular taxes that you're already being taxed, it's just too much. So you spend it or stretch it out over time. That's great, not a problem. We'll get a handle on it, we'll stretch it out over time. But if you continue to deficit spend, you never get it. You never get. And again, the problem isn't that we owe ourselves the money. All right, those who owe treasury bills, those who've invested in bonds, we owe ourselves the money. We're going to get paid plus interest. The interest, and certainly the principal that's held by entities outside the country, that makes us poorer as a nation. Those are resources controlled by individuals outside the country that makes us poorer. And we don't get, that interest, and I don't know what the interest is now, but it used to be 15 cents on every dollar went to the interest. Just to the interest. You don't get any more school. You don't get any more jobs training. You don't get any more road for that money. 15 cents on every dollar.